Of the land on which we meet this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be with us in the audience this evening. Well, I am very, very pleased to be here and to be able to welcome you to this bold thinking event on the future of universities. This is the last Bold Thinking lecture for this year, and it's been a very special 50th anniversary year for La Trobe University. Many of you have been on this journey with us over the last 12 months, and it's coming to an end, but we'll have some very fond memories of good debates, interesting discussions, and tonight will be no exception. The Bold Thinking series is an important public forum for discussing thought-provoking and controversial and contemporary issues. This year, our Bold Thinking lectures have considered topics as diverse as the future of work, health, law and sexuality with Michael Kirby, food, mood and diet, and last month's lecture featured former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on China's rise and the New World Order. In addition to this, we have also held regional lectures in Bendigo and Shepparton on topics such as multiculturalism and social cohesion, as well as a special lecture in August featuring the very famous La Trobe 3 alumni. These have been topics in which La Trobe has an active research interest, and the lectures have been an avenue through which we've been able to share with you some of the more innovative thinking and research that La Trobe has to offer. Before I introduce our special guests for this evening, let me make some brief remarks about this evening's topic, which I think will provide very timely and insightful discussion. The conversation tonight will explore the history of Australian universities, debating their role in today's modern society, and we'll be asking what the future could and perhaps should be in the decades to come. What are the challenges and what is needed for students, industry and community in terms of what universities have to offer? So to discuss these issues, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce tonight's distinguished panel. If Australian higher education had a royal family, arguably these three panellists would be the front-runners. First of all, Professor Margaret Gardner AO. She became President and Vice-Chancellor of Monash University in September 2014. Prior to joining Monash, Professor Gardner was Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT from 2005 to mid-2014. She has extensive academic experience, having held various leadership positions in Australian universities throughout her career, including at the University of Queensland and Griffith University. Armed with a first-class honours degree in economics and a PhD from the University of Sydney, in 1988 she was a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow, spending time at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cornell University and the University of California, Berkeley. In 2007, Professor Gardner was made an officer of the Order of Australia in recognition of her service to tertiary education, particularly in the areas of university governance and gender equity and to industrial relations in Queensland. She is widely respected across the sector and is the current chair of Universities Australia, the peak body of the Australian university constellation, shall we say. Then Professor Glyn Davis AC has been Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Melbourne since January 2005. He is Professor of Political Science in the Faculty of Arts. He holds first-class honours from the University of New South Wales and a PhD from the Australian National University. He undertook postgraduate appointments as a Harkness Fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, the Brookings Institute in Washington, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Alongside an academic career starting in 1985 at Griffith University, Professor Davis has also worked in government, serving as Queensland's most senior public servant, Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, before returning to Griffith as Vice-Chancellor in early 2002. This involvement with the public sector continued through a role as the Foundation Chair of the Australian and New Zealand School of Government and recognition as the National Fellow with the Institute of Public Administration here in Australia. And we should also note that tomorrow marks the launch of Glyn's book entitled The Australian Idea of a University, and no doubt we'll be treated to some insights from that book this evening. And finally, and very importantly, Professor John Dewar is the Vice-Chancellor and President of Trobe University, a position that he has held since 2012. Professor Dewar is internationally recognised as a family law specialist and researcher. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, where he was also a Fellow of Hertford College from 1990 to 1995. He taught at the Universities of Lancaster and Warwick in the UK and worked for the London law firms Allen & Overy and Farrer & Co. Professor Dewar came to Australia in 1995 and held senior leadership positions at Griffith University and the University of Melbourne, where he was provost before taking up the position of Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe. Professor Dewar was named by The Australian as one of the most influential thinkers in higher education in 2014 and 15. I'm going to stop there, ladies and gentlemen. I think you've heard that we have a stellar lineup, and equally stellar, I'm very pleased to welcome our esteemed host and Walkley-Award-winning broadcaster, journalist, and importantly, an alumna from both the University of Melbourne and La Trobe University, which is no mean feat, Virginia Trioli. Please join me in welcoming our panel and Virginia. Thanks so much.
Professor, thank you. Thanks, everyone, and good evening. But seriously, with credentials like that, it's enough to render one speechless, isn't it, really? I think you might know if you watch me or listen to me on radio or see me on TV, I don't usually sort of, fall about cringing in the face of authority, but this panel might just get me. Well, it's November, and we were discussing just before we came here that there are certain triggers in November for those of us who studied. The moment I start to see the jasmine out, I immediately get this sinking pit of terror in my stomach, and I realise, oh God, exams. So I'm sort of already in that mode. So let's see how well I behave myself. What I'm hoping, though, is that we won't all behave ourselves that well. This is a quasi Q&A in the style of the Q&A that I am lucky enough to present on ABC TV from time to time. So I really want to engage you and involve you right from the beginning. And it'll proceed in the same way as it does on Q&A. We'll go through a number of topics, a number of areas. If you have a question related to the subject under discussion, where we are, not where you'd like us to be or where we've been, but where we are, whack your hand up, I'll get a microphone to you, and we'd love to hear from you. I know you hear that every time you go to an evening like this. I mean it. I really want your voice, and I want to hear from you, and I want your questions and your engagement with a really important topic, one that, if you read some of the commentators, is almost spelling out a future of absolute doom for our university. So it's a serious one to engage with. Hopefully the social media will also engage with us in conversation as well, and I'll be calling on them as well. But in preparation for our discussion this evening, I was reading some of the commentary, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone up here on the stage, the recent Ernst & Young report that found that universities must adapt or perish. If they don't, they won't survive unless they radically overhaul their business model. They won't be here in 20 years' time. It's a really rather grim outlook. So, panellists, good evening and welcome. Welcome to your miserable future. But look, I'm going to ask you, and we'll go around the panel on this one. I want you, as independently as you can, as disinterestedly as you can. Imagine that you are an interplanetary management consultant. You're a management consultant from Mars who's been called down here on Earth. You know nothing of the university sector here, but a great deal about the university sector. How would you characterise it if your bosses back at the management consultancy had asked you to put together a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, for the university sector here in Australia? Just a few words along those lines. Margaret, I'll start with you.
Always daunting to be first. I don't know that I can be an interplanetary management consultant. I don't even think I can be a very plausible management consultant. What I would say if I looked in, probably not from so very great a distance, is that if you look at Australia, where we look superficially very similar to a lot of other university systems from which we're derived, and we certainly look a lot like the United Kingdom. And if you're in the United Kingdom at the moment and you were a Vice-Chancellor, you would find life much, much more challenging than we are finding it, and much, much more disturbing. So you might think, oh, I can see a future which is very threatening. One of the things that is different about Australia is we have had a type of level of autonomy and openness to the world, and that has actually caused a series of things that I know have been commented on as often by people as being dreadful. You know, are we too international is really often how people talk. Are they really too managerialist? But in fact, the reality is that the independence and the autonomy we've had, and that ability to play in the world around us and to educate beyond the little backyard in which we started, that is something that has given us a degree of resilience that will serve us well, because it is a turbulent world. It isn't an easy world, and so you need a degree of independence, that autonomy and independence, and with it a degree of resilience. And that's, I guess, what I'd say is one of the great things that makes me feel less threatened and more optimistic.
John?
Look, I think there are a lot of strengths. It's now a very important part of the economy. It's worth, the sector, I think, generates earnings of about $29 billion a year, and a lot of that is earnings from overseas, so it's a big export industry. There's no doubt that it contributes significantly to building the skills and well-being of our workforce and the nation as a whole. The sector has expanded dramatically in the last 20 years, such that we now offer essentially 40% of young people the opportunity to acquire a higher education. And if you think back, that is such a profound transformation since the end of the Second World War, for example. I mean, I think Glyn will know the stats better than I do, but I think at the end of the war, about 1% of the population could expect to go to university. It's now 40%, and that's a huge social transformation. At the same time, Australian universities have improved the quality of the student experience, so far as we can tell from the evidence. So the questions of what happens in the classroom and how we assure the quality of that are now much more front and centre than they were 20 years ago, and all the evidence is that students are reporting higher and higher levels of satisfaction over that time. And productivity in the sector has been significantly improved over that period. And at the same time, Australian universities, particularly the two on either side of me, hold their heads very high and very strong international company on all the measures we have available to us. So I think there are huge strengths, but there are plenty of weaknesses, and I'm sure we'll come to those more in a moment.
We will. Glyn?
Well, if I was a management consultant from Mars, I'd know the answer to the David Bowie song. But I guess the thing that would puzzle me if I was looking from outside, and it wouldn't matter almost which of the Anglo-American countries I arrived in, is how come all the success that's just been described, all completely accurately, produces hostility? How come that we're now living through a process where, and Margaret mentioned what's going on in the UK, if you're not following it closely, the attacks on universities are just extraordinary and unprecedented. And it's government that's doing the attacking. It's it's government and opposition. It's a sort of unusual alliance between Lord Adonis on the Labor side, and if you've ever seen a picture of Lord Adonis, you'd feel for him, given that name, and that he looks nothing like Lord Adonis should look, and the Conservatives. And this is not where we've been before. In the United States, the budget that's just gone through the House of Representatives has massive cuts to science, raises graduate taxes significantly and introduces significant taxes to university endowments. This is not something we've seen before. And here in Australia, if we're going to get an attack on a university, it's going to come from the government, because that's been the pattern of the last 12 months. In order to justify cuts, they have to constantly raise concerns about how the universities are going. And you do find yourself wondering if that's what the Minister for Education thinks. What is everybody else saying? And that's actually quite puzzling for me to explain. I don't have a neat explanation for it. I observe the trend and wonder what it is that triggers that. Why, when we hit 40% graduation rates, or dissipation more accurately, why would that be a trigger for actually increased hostility? Some of it is coming from the resentment that you have to go to university, that it's now necessary for employment, and that's a part of our population that doesn't like that, and that's even clearer and stronger in the United States.
That the universities somehow have future workers over a barrel, if you like.
You have to do this. Some of it's resentment that university, the things associated with universities, innovation, technology, make it changing and taking away jobs. Some of it's the end of a familiar world, and the resentment about apprenticeships disappearing, as though that were driven by universities as opposed to significant changes in the skilled workforce, that where apprenticeships were important, and the loss of vocational education. And some of it is frankly political, because it's about, university graduates earn a lot more money over their lifetime. That's true in most societies. That shows up in lifestyle and outcomes. And no one who wonders about the Trump victory in the United States misses that the single best explanation of Democratic voters who changed between 2012 and 2016 was education level. It was Democrats without a university degree who shifted to Trump. In the United Kingdom, of course, in the Brexit poll, 3 out of 4 of the voters who supported Brexit had no tertiary qualifications. That's not to say they didn't understand or they're stupid. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, on the contrary, the clear dividing line in that society was an education dividing line, more than class, more than income, more than all of the usual variables. So I think universities are sort of sitting on a fault line that might not have a lot to do directly with universities, but to do a lot with the way our societies have developed in the last couple of years.
And we'll get to a lot of the aspects that you just spooled through there, but we should pick up on that a bit, because in preparation for this, I was talking to someone who is, very connected into the university sector here, and they said something very similar to me, Glyn, to what you said then, that, there's never been a time where universities have been more significant, bigger, serviced more students, as you say, successful in the work that they do, educating people well, and yet never so attacked and seen as such a negative. John, Margaret, do you have any reflections on that? On Glyn's given us a few reasons about why he thinks that might be.
I made the comment about the UK because you can see it in their media, but one has to understand that the mainstream media, which is what I'm reflecting on and what Glyn is reflecting on, is, I don't think, any longer a very good guide to what I'd call broader public opinion. So I think the point about where the attacks are coming from and what about has to be separated from what the views are of people at large. Because if you run a survey and say to people, what do you aspire for your children? And we know this, it's been done in Australia, and a huge percentage, we're talking 85% plus, say they'd like their children to go to university. I think if you ask a question about trusting research outcomes, what do you understand of science? Do you believe what you heard about gravitational waves? Do you understand what people say about food or nutrition or cancer? You will find a very strong set of opinions which say, I can trust what has been said, I trust this research. So I think what we're seeing is a sort of disconnection, which I think is showing up in other social spheres. And so it's not helpful, and it has to be looked at, because if that hostility is coming from key agencies like government that make policy, and if you are in an institution where that policy has significant impact because you are a public university, then you have to pay attention to that and worry about how it's being formed. But do I think that it actually speaks to all the things about what people understand and value? No, I think it doesn't. But I think it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for us to put those disconnected pieces together in a way that explains what is important, what needs to be preserved, what needs to be changed. And that's a challenge for us.
John?
Look, I agree with everything that's been said, but I'd add a couple of things. One is that, as I said before, universities have expanded significantly. Massification has been the dominant motif of higher education over the last 20 years, which means that universities are now very, very big organisations. What's your annual turnover?
Well, it depends whether you count the university alone or the consolidated. At consolidated, well, we're running over $2.5 billion revenue a year.
Huge. And you're not far short of that, probably.
Oh, no, it's probably ahead.
Larger.
Yeah.
I mean, these are...
Which means if you
More
use
dollars.
the ASX as the guide, the top 15 Australian universities would sort of easily sit in the top 100 Australian companies by scale.
We're doing our best with this microphone, so we'll try.
Okay.
Thank you. We seem to be struggling with yours. Glyn,
Can you hear
so-
me, Patricia? Yeah, okay. All right.
Can you hear me? Speak to large
Yeah,
crowd.
okay.
Well, I made that long rant about Trobe worth.
It means you're off the record, and that's quite good. But Glyn, I will just advise, if you're going to use that, I need you to hold it right up there. Otherwise, you won't be heard at all. So, but keep going.
I was just making a passing point to John's point, and that is that if you think about the scale of Australian universities, they're all sitting now in, they'd all be counted in the ASX if they were.
But John, you're making a broader point. Is your no, you're fine. He's fine. Is your point about resentment?
Yes,
of the size?
it's about universities just being another example of big business.
The top end of town.
Yes, exactly. And putting up flashy new buildings with huge endowments, all of that. And I think it just...
Margaret's eyes say, I'd love some of those huge endowments.
Yeah, I like his endowments. So I think that's part of it. They've become very big and quite powerful organisations. And there may be a sense that universities have almost gone beyond accountability for the size and impact that they have in the community.
Do you think that's fair, Margaret?
I think that what we are seeing, because of the need for greater skills and capabilities, and because of the role of the research in universities, which I think has grown, well, it's particularly important in Australia in future innovation and development, that their impact is greater. And when you reach, for example, the scale, because the scale, for example, of Monash or Melbourne or La Trobe is larger than it would be if we were confined only to Australia, because apart from massification, globalisation is the other, or internationalisation, depending how you want to think about it, it's the other big trend. So the economic impact of these universities on their regions, which is positive, because everything we earn goes back into the university. It doesn't go somewhere else into some mystical set of unknown shareholders. It's going back into the university, and it procures, we buy things, all sorts of things. So that impact is huge. I don't think that's a source of resentment. I think that's something that's not understood. It's actually a massive benefit to regions, but it does mean that you are big, and people are often worried by big.
Just one other point. There are two other corollary things that go with that growth in scale. One is a move to, I suppose, more managerial cultures.
Yeah.
Because managing organisations of this scale
requires...
simply have
to be. Yes.
Yeah, I would argue you do. But the other is that with 40% of young people now going through universities, or very close to it, there is an argument that we've denuded the vocational sector. that there are people going to university who should really be training to be plumbers or electricians.
And we'll get to that as well.
Yeah, other people's children. Yeah. So universities get blamed for that as well. I think that we're sucking up too much of our youth and not training them usefully.
Well, given that you seem as a sector to be facing this existential dilemma of, will you continue to exist? It certainly won't be in this form, and if it's not in this form, will you manage the transition or not? What's a university for these days? Glyn?
That implies a single answer, and there doesn't have to be a single answer.
Doesn't have to be a single answer.
No,
Never said that.
So there are three missions. Well, what is a university for? There are three missions that every university has in some variation. And the first is the teaching mission, and it's the historic mission, and it's the reason we were set up in the first place. And if you don't teach, it's very hard to see you as a university, though they exist. There are universities that don't teach. The ANU, for example, was set up not to teach. A proud tradition, it probably continues, but it was set up to be a research-only university, and we gave it the title university. So
we're recording this, by the way.
That's okay. I'm a proud ANU graduate. The second, of course, is research, and this is the main game for many people who work in universities, but by no means the only thing we do. But if you look at the publicity about universities, it's an endless breakthroughs, new medical, that's the issue we face. It's part of why we're undermining the public trust, I think. So research is really important. And the third is engagement, which has different names and has different flavours in institutions. But it's about what do we do for the world that we're part of? How do we engage with the community? How do we contribute to those people who will not study on our campus and who may not know that the research that's done has implications for them? That's the underdone part of our university sector, and it's the important trend of the last decade or more has been seeing that increase. One of the other big parts of this is the very traditional role of helping young people form their character and work out who they are and what they want in life. And one of the reasons that I'm not worried by digital in the same way is that if there's any trend going on below the radar, it's the number of young people who want to come to university and live on campus and actually have a traditional university experience which it goes way beyond anything that we do in the classroom and is about the being part of an institution, being part of an experience.
And them defining it themselves.
And defining it themselves. And that is powerfully alive. It hasn't changed.
John, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I just wanted to take a slightly different... I absolutely agree with Glyn that there's no single answer to the question. But
By the way, you don't always have to absolutely agree with Glyn tonight.
No, I'll try not to.
It's not mandatory.
If you look at it historically, universities have existed for a long time, over 1,000 years, and they have played different purposes and different roles throughout that period. And I think what we've got now is the accumulation of what you might think of as sedimentary layers that have built up over that period of time. And there are elements of all of the different missions that universities have played or had during that period. So, you've got the role of just pure metaphysical speculation, the philosophical and theological questions of being, which universities once and still perform. You've got the research function that Glyn's talked about. More recently, universities have had to become more business-like, so there is an element of becoming efficient and financially sustainable. And then there is this, I think, probably more recent question of relevance.
Yes.
And I think in order to survive, and this might be something we might explore in a moment, but in order to survive, I think universities have to demonstrate their value and relevance. And I think that's another way of describing the engagement mission that Glyn's talking about.
Well, can I look? Yeah. At this point, I am parting company with my esteemed colleagues. There is no existential crisis in universities of which I'm aware, and I have worked in universities and different universities of different types for a considerable period of time. I do not see an existential crisis. I do not see people who are worrying what the purpose is. one of the key things about being a university is you are not an organisation. You do not sell cornflakes and decide that you've decided to go into selling orange juice. We are not organisations, we are institutions. And the point about institutions, and there is a conceptual difference, the point about institutions is they have underlying and continuing purpose, which has been talked about here. And of course the way you do education and how important it is and where it fits in the society shifts, or research, which is actually a more modern part of universities, or indeed their relationship with the community, that is, whether they're fighting between town and gown or whether they're embracing the town, as they do more now, rather than having pitched battles, as at one point was more common in Europe. Yes, the way it manifests change, but the underlying purpose, what are you there for? That is what institutions know. It's why they continue. What we are actually talking about is not an existential crisis in universities, not a question of relevance. There is actually a greater need for engagement with questions and challenges and global challenges and education of people. More people are seeking all those things and are educated to a point where they can participate in the debate and the conversation about what are the questions and are these the answers that we are prepared to accept. So I actually think that it has become more embedded in many parts of what we do. What we're actually talking about is the sort of noise that goes in disrupted and fractious political environments. And we're in an epoch where we have a bit fractious and disrupted political environments because the nature of what the divisions were and the way we coalesced about what sorts of things we supported is shifting. And when that happens, people shift and seek and worry. And if we get any economic undermining, people look for things to be worried about. But I am not worried about universities and what they... Not universities qua, whether this university is going to live for the next 300 years, but the institutional form that says we are going to take you on that journey in which you understand the world in a way you would not have understood it before, and you will find something new in it, and that we will ask the question that you weren't prepared to ask. Universities are powerful because unless you have an institution that will let people ask the question that people in control don't want asked, you have got a problem. That's what kills everything. And so I am not worried at all in that way. I am concerned. I am concerned that we have to engage in the way the debate manifests at this time and in this place, but it is not existential.
That's interesting because all three of you have expressed that in slightly different ways this evening so far, which is about that concept of engagement, community, political, whatever it might be. But I'm going to press you on that, and I do want to get some questions from the audience as we go through these topics now as well. Just on there not being that crisis. I know that in preparation for tonight, I've spoken to people, and more than two, have said to me that they are worried that young people simply won't go to universities in the future, that there is a serious concern about that. Does anyone on the panel have that as a concern?
Well, what I want to suggest to you is, and I am completely optimistic about universities, as I said, so I'm not sure that Margaret is departing from her fellow panellists, but what we've never had before is a credible alternative to universities that poses a challenge. And for the first time now, we have organisations, private organisations, which are claiming that they can replicate the university experience online in very different, much cheaper forms. And that's the new development. So, and this is not that new. Peter Drucker in the early 1990s, before the web, before internet courses, talked about how mail-order universities were going to wipe out traditional universities and that the university was inevitably fraught. And now we have a series of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who are arguing either that they can replace universities by offering much cheaper online offerings, or in some cases that young people shouldn't go to universities. And to give that a practical example, one of the co-founders of PayPal is Peter Thiel, and Peter Thiel believes strongly that you don't really need to go to university. If you're very bright, it's enough to get in. Once you're in, why would you waste time actually going to Stanford? Once you got through the selection criteria, your point is made, and it's only a credential thing. It's not, you're not actually going to learn anything at university. And to show that he takes this seriously, he offers $100,000 scholarships to young people who get into prestigious universities if they agree not to go, but instead to start a business. And he calls these Thiel fellowships. And now across America, thousands of young people are applying to not go to university. And instead to get a Thiel fellowship.
So that fear is well founded then in some places, in some quarters.
Well, this is a sort of, you can argue that there's a high degree of Silicon Valley hyperbole in all of this, and that actually, even in America, even with its private provision, more than 70% of students go to public universities and continue to go to public universities in America. There isn't any sign that enrolments are about to crash or fall.
Yep.
But we do, for the first time, as a sector, face a direct challenge that we do need to think about that does offer a genuine set of alternatives. And while I might share the optimism that they're not going to wipe out the public university isn't going to have all its own way in a way that we used to. Both private providers and political discontent are going to come together in ways that are challenging for us.
Okay. John, I'd like to hear from you on that. Do you agree with Glyn?
No.
Apparently not. If the question is, will students continue to come to university, then my answer to that would be, for the foreseeable future, yes, because there are lots of material reasons why they would. So, for example, I'd say about 90% of the degrees that most universities offer are professionally accredited. Entry into a profession, most professions in this country, is via the route of a university degree. And that's one of the things that universities have done very successfully over the last 20, 30 years, is monopolise pathways into professional entry, in collusion with the professions who've been delighted to raise their status by requiring a university degree as a precondition of entry.
However...
That pertains at the moment, and I think will pertain for some time to come, and will sort of bolster students coming to university because they desire the qualification and they therefore have to come to us to get it, for the most part, although private providers increasingly are moving into that space. But there are barriers to entry for them too, quite high barriers to entry. However, all of that could change very quickly. Employers could suddenly decide, and there are signs of this starting to happen, that they don't require university degrees amongst their
Tell us, there's a couple of examples that we know of, from PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, Penguin. Speak a little bit about that. I mean, they are making a direct appeal to their future workforce and saying, come to us and we'll train you instead.
So they're not looking for formal qualifications, they're looking for skills and attributes. Now, it may be, and I don't know if there's anyone from either of those organisations here tonight, but it may be that...
Any PwC employers or employees here? No? Okay.
It may be that even though they no longer stipulate a degree as required, that they actually end up recruiting graduates. It's possible. But it wouldn't take a lot for all of that to fall away, the things that underpin student pathways into university to disappear. And a lot rides on what value employers attach to the qualifications that students acquire at university.
Just quickly, hold that thought, Margaret. Are there any questions, any hands up? Would you like to get in? I have one up the back here. Yes, and Margaret, but hold that thought, don't lose it. And try and keep your question where we are in the conversation. Thank you.
Good evening, and I'd like to thank La Trobe University and Monash University for my education. Now, it seems to me that you are worried about your status quo vis-à-vis the present situation. And yet the Vice-Chancellor of Monash pointed out, or I think it was, Melbourne, one of you, that there is a 1,000-year-old tradition And that tradition was the spirit of the human being rising above very demanding situations of the early or late medieval times, going against dogma that brought you to the stake, and yet they rose above it. Now, surely we can do the same today. I was reading on the train on the way down here, Vivekananda, and he was urging India at that time to show courage. Where is that courage? Where is the vision? The world is changing, but there is a fundamental basis within universities that's millenarian. What has it got to worry? You need better representation in Parliament. You need to tell politicians where to stop.
Okay. I've got the point of your question, and we will come to that. Margaret, finish the thought you were going to, and then let's reflect on that a little bit, and it transitions us to another conversation.
So I want to begin in part where John began, about this education of the professions, but to take that into this question of where the challenge comes from. Certainly there are a huge number of educational organisations out there. And we are in a globalising world, and students are more mobile. So let's be clear, it is a big plane out there, and so it's competitive. But if you take the nature of the education, and let's stick with the professions for a moment. Education for the professions, which is in fact where a lot of European universities began, is actually important, and it's important for this reason. Because what is actually happening is in that education, that person is building depth and capability. So they're building knowledge and practice, if you like. But what is happening is the institution, in the way it does that, is assuring the public that when this person turns up, they won't cut off your toe when they needed to make an incision in your arm, that the bridge they put up will stay up, that the communications, that the electricity will run through here, and we will actually get a sound system that works. So it is not a trivial thing to reproduce not just the level of capabilities, because there's a complexity in what people do, because professions have become, in fact, more complex and therefore more specialised, and so depth of knowledge is greater, and our dependence on what they do is arguably greater than it was when we started putting in legal professions and surgeons and the like. And we need an assurance that they will do what they do effectively. The university is an independent assurance of that. So if I decide to go to an unnamed consulting firm because they will take me in because I'm a brilliant young person and they are prepared to give me the experience that they think will be valuable, well, the only question we will all ask ourselves is this. When they merge or go under, and that person goes to say, I really am the trusted accountant that you could look to, or indeed I am the trusted engineer that ran the information technology from that company, what do you think the answer is? How many people are trusting? So it is the independence and the independent accreditation through the professions and the depth of knowledge, and that is not easily replicated. You can break down bits of it, you can teach people how to code online without ever seeing a person. You can't teach people how to build a bridge that way. You can't teach people how to be... You can do there are a series of things you can do, there are a series of things that you currently can't do, and don't tell me about visual simulations. Yes, they will get better and it will be more important, but it doesn't actually take away from the complexity of what is being provided. And that is why, yes, there is competition, and competition comes in elements, but that question of the trust and assurance that when we go out there, you know, and you think you know what is going to happen, that I would think seriously if I was a young person before a company that has nothing except their temporary name, and name me many of them that have lasted more than 100 years, is going to give me that I can go somewhere else in some other country and do what I do, and somebody will trust me. But I tell you what, if you walk out there with a Monash degree and you turn up somewhere else, they'll hire you.
Let me talk to you then, all of you, about you must in your various universities be reflecting on what changes and what particular challenges you're going to have to cope with. And there's no shortage of commentators out there who are eager to help you with what they think you should be doing now and what you should be focusing on, whether it's specialising as universities by targeting particular student groups and kinds of students, using your assets more efficiently, of course, who wouldn't want to do that, partnering more closely with industry, working on the community engagement and connection that you mentioned, Glyn. So let's talk amongst ourselves, and perhaps some questions from the group in the room on this as well. What are the big focuses for you? What's the, I won't say survival focus, but I know you've got an eye to that. What are the areas of focus that are going to get you through to your next incarnation, your next stage, John?
So at La Trobe, we're thinking very carefully about two things that we think the current moment of disruption or Industry 4.0 or whatever you like to call it, challenges that this will throw up for universities. The first is how do we ensure our graduates are well equipped for life, and in particular for the workforce that is changing very, very quickly. Yeah. And a lot of the assumptions that have been made about pathways into the workforce for young people that were around when all of us went to university are just no longer true. And there are a whole range of complicated reasons for that. So we're giving a lot of thought to how can we better support our students, our graduates, into productive lives and productive work. And that goes well beyond the traditional embedding of graduate attributes in degrees or curriculum, giving students opportunities for work experience. We're actually thinking that there's a moral obligation resting on us as an institution to do everything we can to prepare a young person to be as fully formed as possible, ready to enter what comes next. So that's one thing. We're also thinking about how, given what the discussion we've just had about university stock in trade is the 3-year bachelor's degree. That's what government by and large pays us to provide. But I think for all the reasons we've talked about and many others, I think the 3-year bachelor's degree will come under increasing strain as our main product in the shop window, if you like.
What does that mean?
Well, it goes back to the question about what employers will value, I think. And if employers cease, as we talked about earlier, cease to require degrees in the people they hire into their jobs, then I think that starts to undermine the value of that as a qualification. But I also think the way that knowledge is changing now, the shelf life of professional skills and knowledge is getting shorter.
Yeah.
And
that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Yeah. So back when I was at university, it was the degree and maybe a little bit of updating along the way, but gosh, absolutely no more. Yeah.
So we've moved. I think we're moving from a front-loading washing machine model to a top-loading washing machine model, and it may be that at the front you don't need that 3-year experience. You might need something shorter, but with repeated.
In fact,
top-ups.
I think you talk a little bit about after-sales service.
Yes.
Don't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, we've been going well beyond graduation. How can we continue to stay in touch with our graduates and continue to support them?
Right.
That's essentially what we mean. So drawing on our alumni, drawing on industry partners to help them navigate this very disrupted workforce that's now emerging.
Glyn?
So I not only agree with John, as I must always, on the 3-year degree is problematic. I mean, Melbourne moved away from it some years ago precisely for that ground. We moved to graduate education for the professions. So you do broad liberal studies at undergraduate level, then you move into the professions. That was not a popular move for lots of people. It extends how long you stay at university. It has a number of downsides. It has spectacular educational upside, which is why we did it, because it's about producing better students. The way our demand-driven system works in Australia, the preferences of 18-year-olds decide the shape of universities, because that's where the money comes in, and that's ultimately what shapes us. And we're relying as a nation that 18-year-olds will know sort of wisdom of the crowds, that collectively they'll know where they should be investing their time, and that will shape our future workforce.
The room, which was once all 18-year-olds, has sort of just grown slightly then, thinking about it, but, you know, so watch it, you know.
No,
we were once those people. Madam, I see you and I'll come to you.
And no criticism of 18-year-olds. They have to make a choice. That's the whole point. But in a sense, we have a responsibility as well as universities to try and provide some guideposts about where we think the future is and what the opportunities are. And all three of us worked a long time ago at Griffith University in Queensland, a wonderful institution. It had a group of researchers who did brilliant work in photonics. And we tried and tried to persuade young, in fact 17-year-olds in Queensland, that there was a future in photonics, that this is an area they should get into. And we could never fill the classes because there was no television show about photonics. They didn't know what it was, what it meant, and they couldn't see a future. They couldn't see a pathway into a future. That's going to be true
and you can't be what you can't see.
Exactly, and that's going to be true. You know, most of the future professions are going to be jobs that people have never heard of.
Yeah.
So we face this really interesting challenge. How do we help people see that future and see themselves in that future, and then take themselves to it?
Margaret, a reflection on your particular area of focus then for Monash into the future, and then we'll come to our question.
Like everybody else, we are worried. I won't go into it because it is the same thing. I will agree with all my colleagues about this, that while I think that trusted role it is a bit more complex, more specialised, it comes in different forms, it will be put together in different ways, and they're the changes so we're all worried about that. We're worried about how we tap our understandings in research about where research frontiers are taking us in terms of new specialisations, and what industry is telling us about where they're going, so that we talk about professions of the future. How will we rethink what is out there? But the thing that I think is really, really important, that is very important for me, is that, and I just spoke to a group of alumni last night, and it was really interesting how many of them reflected on what we would call aspects of internationalisation in their experience. I went overseas, I had this experience here, how it opened my mind there. And Australia is now quite a successful internationaliser, not just in the sense that everybody understands that lots of international students come here, which fundamentally changes the educational experience both for them and for domestic students, and I think with really positive outcomes. But Australia now sends about, on average, and it's much higher in some universities, 19% of its undergraduates overseas for an experience. That's very high by any standard. That's that making people uncomfortable. Oh, the question looked different when I stood there. They didn't think about it that way. They talked. So that's a big part of the education, and we have to get it right. And it has to be in ways that aren't just, I've gone to another university. So increasingly, I'm having an internship over here. I'm part of a team working in this company over there solving a problem. That sort of richness of experience, which takes, because this is the big possibility, knowledge is without borders. And giving people through their education that experience, because when it's without borders, it doesn't mean it's all the same. It means you have to translate it in context, and that internationalisation, which Australia does well, I think is a bigger part of our future.
So I had a question. Sorry, Matt, it was yes, it's just here. If I can get the microphone there. Put your hand up again so we can see you. Thank you.
I just want to go back to a comment that John made about the moral obligation of universities for employment, and that Glyn made about 18-year-olds choosing finance and control of universities. It is quite a dilemma. The universities themselves have been guilty of doing things which are understandable in many ways, but the plethora of law courses and that are around at the moment. And yes, 18-year-olds want to do law, but there is no employment at the end. How do you deal with that dilemma now and in the future? Because, for example, if the internet is making law relatively cheap to do, it will also be making other courses relatively cheap. How do you mould that responsibility of employment with the practicalities of your finances?
You're looking at me. Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah. All right. I was quoted.
And then, but we'll hear from Glyn and Margaret on that too.
Yeah. Look, thank you. That's a really important question. And in part, it goes to the way that universities are funded. We have been, since 2012, in what's called a demand-driven system, in which universities have been allowed to enrol students, as many students in whichever disciplines they like, subject to some minimum standards of preparedness and so on. And you're right, it's easy to point to examples of universities possibly starting up courses just because they're appealing rather than because their graduates are needed. But can I just say that to focus on that actually misses a bigger picture, which is that over that period of time, the biggest increase in enrolments in universities, without doubt, has been in the science and health disciplines, which is actually extremely well matched to what we need in terms of the future workforce. So although you can always point to egregious examples of bad practice, probably, or less than optimal practice, perhaps, I think you shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the demand-driven system has actually produced really good outcomes in terms of the way universities have enrolled students and where students have chosen to enrol themselves. The question, there are lots of criticisms that can be made of it. The question is always, how else would you do it? And the only real alternative to what we've got at the moment is someone in Canberra saying, well, you can't have a law school, or you can only have so many students in pharmacy or physiotherapy or whatever it is. And I'm not sure that that's a better way of doing it.
Margaret, just a brief reflection on that, and so we can get to some other topics before our time runs out.
I think it is incumbent on us to think seriously about how we deal with the employment futures of our students. And that is not the same as saying you came in as a lawyer and it is our job to make you a lawyer, because we are giving people an education, and in fact large numbers of lawyers choose quite quickly, even if they go into law, not to be lawyers, just as nurses choose not to be nurses, etc. So our job is to actually give people the wherewithal to flexibly find their way, and we should be able to do that for everyone. Whether, yes, you want to give them experiences, people who are passionate about going in that field, try and build those experiences. But we are also educating, and this is the thing to remember, this is not an education system where we're educating people for tomorrow, and we're certainly not educating them for the suburb next door. Our graduates are all over the world. They'll come to us from all over the world. They'll go back all over the world. I've got to tell you, my base degree was economics. You know, the one area that does not work? Manpower planning, as it used to be called in the dim, dark days when I first did my economics degree. You cannot predict in a way that makes sense over the time frames in which we educate how many you should take into profession X that will go out into profession X, because they may choose not to do it. It won't look like that. So you have to give the support to their employability and their flexibility. That's the key.
Glyn?
I think it's been well said. We should move on.
Okay. I wanted to ask, and we've got to get to the money question at some point here, because the funding issue and cost of degrees and that challenge is a huge one. But before we get to that, what of the prospect and maybe even the necessity of consolidation in the sector? I think in Victoria we've got 9 universities in Victoria alone. And there are other places in the world where a group of campuses might be considered part of one university system, like UCAL, for example.
Yep.
So what are your reflections on consolidation? Is that something coming down the road, do you think, Glyn?
So let me surprise you then by saying University of Melbourne has 65,000 students, which makes us the 5th biggest city in Victoria, and only the 3rd largest university in the city of Melbourne. Australian universities are the largest in the world on average. There's no other country that has so large institutions. We haven't started a new institution now for a generation. We have just piled additional students into our existing institutions, and with the issues that John talked about, the management structures and everything that follows, when you have 65,000 students, or in the case of Monash, 78 or 80 or
We're over
thereabouts.
75.
These are huge institutions. When the city of Ballarat is smaller than a number of the universities in Melbourne, that tells you where we've gone. So rather than consolidation, I think what we have a desperate need for is specialisation and opportunities for smaller institutions that take a particular area of expertise and develop deep understanding of that area and attract students whose passion is that area, so that we have the variety. Of course, we're going to have large and comprehensive institutions like the 3 on the stage, and that isn't going to change. What we don't have is alternatives. What we don't have is opportunities for people to say, yes, I really like what La Trobe does, and it's wonderful, this qualification, but my passion is aeronautical engineering, and there's this quite small institution there that has depth in aeronautical engineering that no large comprehensive university can develop. I would like to go there. But that is closed to any Australian student at the moment. So rather than consolidation, which I think would give us no benefit at all, if you put Monash, Melbourne and La Trobe together, you've got 200,000 students, but I don't think you've got a better university. You've just got a very alienating experience for anyone who goes to it. It's can we make the system, can we add to the system so we have greater diversity on average, seems to me the objective here.
Which has been one of the themes of the commentary recently about specialisation and focusing on student areas. John, what do you think? Do you agree?
Do I agree with Glyn? Or,
yeah, with Glyn.
Look, I think the barriers to consolidation are very significant. One is that, as Margaret said at the beginning, we are autonomous institutions. So everyone responsible for running to potential merger partners would have to agree that this was the right thing to do. And that is very difficult to achieve. Secondly, it requires a change in legislation because we are the creatures of state government legislation, which immediately puts it into the political domain. As soon as you have to pass legislation in Parliament to effect a merger, then it becomes a political issue. And all it needs is a couple of local members who do not want this campus to close in their constituency, and you've got a problem. So there are reasons why this has never really happened in Australia, because the barriers to it are really immense. There have been smaller scale reorganisations. So Monash in particular has transferred Gippsland to what's now Federation University. In fact, that led to the
and Berwick
and Berwick, which has also gone to Federation University. So there have been small-scale transfers of specific campuses, generally because the new operator, as it were, could do a better job. And I was talking to someone before about the Ipswich campus at UQ, which is now part of the University of Southern Queensland. Yeah. I think that's a great outcome because USQ will do a much better job for that community, begging your pardon, Margaret, as a former UQ Deputy Vice-Chancellor, but than UQ was ever likely to do. So it can happen, but I think large-scale mergers are really hard.
I think it's one of the reform challenges in front of us that as these things become more significant, that I think the sort of examples you gave, should there be a network where you get a series of campuses in a system? I think if we looked at tertiary education Australia as a whole, as opposed to just the universities, we might get some answers about where networks should be, and it might be that in that we would get some answers to the issues we've got with dealing with vocational education as well as higher education. So I think what we need is some policy debate about what those options are, Glyn's specialisation, the difficulty of reshaping, which we've managed to do in various ways in these movements of small, or the looking at new things. I think we've got to open these things up, because I think these are the things where you get innovation and you get those possibilities that let you deal with the way education and how we do it is shifting. And
well, that brings us nicely to the discussion around TAFE and VET. And, this really has kind of, in recent years in Australia, boiled down to, and I think has been deliberately directed that way by, our political betters, as a sort of a bit of a battle, a war between the university sector and the VET TAFE sector, as if they were opposing forces, and I think it's a pretty shallow way of seeing things. But the argument is nonetheless abroad with some people that the university sector has profited at the expense of TAFE VET. It'd be nice to hear some reflections from you on that, and then we can talk a little more about the clearly much more vocational sense and philosophy that you're bringing this evening from a university perspective as well. Glyn, can I start with you on that?
So I'm just remembering the Logan campus of Griffith University, which had the Logan TAFE next to it, and a very large metal fence that ran between them to make sure there was no way. You had to walk out the street around several...
Was there razor wire on the fence as well?
That didn't need
Checkpoint Charlie.
That there, in a sense, was a nice metaphor for how we've organised the system.
Yeah.
We do have institutions, and Margaret's run one, and RMIT, that combine TAFE and Margaret should speak to that. And La Trobe has, in some of its regional campuses, formed very close links to the local TAFE systems, and that's all to the good and worth talking about, and I hope John will tell us something about that. But part of the problem here is the federalism problem, that universities are federally funded. TAFEs and vocational education is largely, they're not exclusively state funded, regulated in different ways with different industrial and other functions. There is no policy forum, there's no place to talk about this in a systematic way. It isn't anybody's problem. They have different ministers, different jurisdictions.
Yeah, but hang on. I'm going to jump in there just because, and you alluded to this earlier in something you said right at the beginning. It's also the case, isn't it, though, that the university sector and the leaders of our universities have been arguing very strongly for the last 10 to 20 years that your child needs a university education, and that's set up, in a sense, maybe some of that resentment or backlash that you've, in your discussions and in your presentation of yourselves and what you offer, you've diminished what the VET and the TAFE sectors have had to offer.
Well, I think it's unfair to argue that we have diminished the VET sectors. The plain economic reality that every parent can see is that their child will be better off if they get a university degree, and every piece of evidence says they're right. So they want the rational thing for their child, and a lot of people want other people's children to go and do apprenticeships or something else. And I felt we saw that in the BCA's proposal recently, where they sort of ran that line that more people should go to other sectors, and it should be harder to get into universities. We went from 1% to 40%, as John rightly pointed out, and there's nothing special about 40%. The UK is now pushing 50%. We will go to a system where a post-school education is pretty much a universal. And so the policy challenge for us is not university versus TAFE. It's providing a constellation of choices so that people can choose, and they won't choose once, as John also pointed out. We're going to a system where you'll be getting education at various points and from different sorts of institutions. We just have such a narrow range of choices at the moment that, of course, it becomes binary. It shouldn't be.
I've noted a question. I'm going to come to you once we hear from the panellists, and then a second one over there. Margaret?
So this is not about... So what we're doing is saying these things that are funded differently and run differently, that's the debate. The truth is there are universities that run everything from enabling courses, which would be seen as a type of vocational qualification, through diplomas, through associate degrees, which could be run in a vocational. So the distinction is not in the sectors themselves. The distinction is in how particular qualifications are funded and where various forms of expertise reside. So when I was Vice-Chancellor of RMIT, we expanded significantly the number of associate degrees, and the reason we did that and why it was so important, RMIT has traditionally taught in the vocational space very high-end qualifications, but the way we have run the vocational education system in Australia is, we said, industry can define what the educational qualifications will be and what will be in them. They became incredibly narrow, incredibly modular, not very flexible, well, apparently flexible. When we allowed our TAFE staff at RMIT to design associate degrees, and they talked to their higher ed colleagues, if you like, the degrees were wonderful, what they did was wonderful, they shifted the pedagogy, they were great. So it isn't that higher education would take from... Some of those students then went from associate degrees to bachelor's degrees, some of them didn't. They went out with qualifications that took them into the workforce. I just think that we have not properly thought through these funding regimes and how they cross across the institutions. And it isn't universities versus vocational education. It is actually, how do we best get the mix of qualifications that allow us to do two things? To supply the things we think we need, and to allow people to shift between the things they think they need. They may want to add... we used to have people who did, for example, an engineering degree that wanted to pick up an electrical certificate because that allowed them to do two things when they got into the construction industry hugely. People who started doing this qualification in vocational education added that degree to it or went through to the degree. We're just hamstringing ourselves with ridiculous sectoral differences. We need to have a post-secondary education reform discussion. Because the other thing when people talk about higher ed taking away from vet, they forget that a lot of what's happening in vocational education is actually up to year 12 equivalents. So we've got a system that's actually, part of it abuts, if you like, to the schools, to year 12 equivalents, and another part that is a series of qualifications that sit in the tertiary space post, if you like, year 12. We've just got the wrong policy frame, we're having the wrong set of discussions, and we are not funding and we are not designing the education at post-secondary in a way that is consistent with high quality skilled capabilities, not because those capabilities aren't there, because we have unfortunately narrowed and undermined what is indeed an excellent vocational education sector.
John, do you have any reflections on that issue of university versus TAFE? And then we'll come to some questions, and I do want to talk about the funding issue.
Just very quickly, although I don't see it as university versus TAFE, because I'm going to give you an example of collaboration between the two sectors that's produced some really great outcomes, we think. So we have a number of regional campuses. In fact, we're the largest university in regional Victoria, measured by student enrolments. The biggest challenge we have is that if you went to somewhere like Mildura, where we have one of our campuses, the participation rate in higher education there is almost a third of what it is in Melbourne. And yet the need in that community for tertiary educated people is just as intense as it is in the city. So how do we close the gap? That's the big challenge we have. How do we persuade more students to contemplate the benefits of coming on not just to university but to any form of post-secondary education, frankly? So what we've decided to do is to collaborate with each of the TAFE institutes with whom essentially we're co-located in those regional areas, and we've created what we call dual enrolment pathways. So students enrol simultaneously in a VET diploma and one of our bachelor's degrees, and the effect of that is that they can exit either at the end of year 1 with a diploma, or year 2 with an advanced diploma, or year 3 with a bachelor's degree. we couldn't do that on our own because government prevents us from offering qualifications below bachelor's level.
Yeah.
That's forbidden to universities unless we go cap in hand to the department and get permission to do it. So this is the only way we can offer that opportunity to students. Now, we do this in a whole range of disciplines with five TAFE partners, and we have a lot of students coming through these pathways. I'll just give you one example of how successful this has been. I met one of our students in Shepparton. I was just killing time. Not that that happens very often, by the way, but waiting for a meeting to start. And I was talking to this student who's a nursing student, was just about to complete her advanced diploma at Goulburn Ovens TAFE and was about to transfer over to us. And I said, why did you enrol in this pathway and not straight into our bachelor's degree? And she said it was because she had no confidence that she would be able to complete a bachelor's degree, but she felt that doing it in bite-sized chunks was exactly suited to her. And it turns out that that is true for a lot of students in regional areas who do not have the family background or the self-confidence to put themselves into a degree program, but they do to put themselves into the first step, which is a TAFE diploma. It works brilliantly.
I think we had a question, sorry. Why do you always keep all your questions to the end? 10 minutes to go, my dear friends. One here, and then, yes, it was over there. Yeah, sir.
Professor Gardner, I'm sure you're aware that in 2016, 46% of Monash enrolments were overseas students, and that percentage is rising quite rapidly. I'm wondering, at what point do you think this share becomes too many in terms of the balance of providing for local and overseas students and the impact it's having on the campus and the growth of particular fields like commerce? And a follow-up question to that is...
I'm not going to take your follow-up. I'm just going to take that one question because we're short of time. Thank you, sir. But that's a good question. Margaret?
Well, in fact, Monash overall, its international student numbers are 25% of its total enrolments. It varies by faculty. It's certainly higher, like every university in Australia, in business and commerce than it is in other faculties. But Monash at 25% international students is not the university with the highest percentage of international students in Australia. Beyond that, we have campuses, one in Malaysia, one in India, one in China, and needless to say, they enrol students from those countries, as well as international students from other countries than the ones they're in. And so some of our students, so if you go to the Mumbai campus, the majority of the students are Indian. If you go to the Malaysian campus, the majority of them are Malaysian. They are not international students. They are, in their own terms, domestic students. And what we are doing by what we are working at is a diversity of international students. So drawn from a broader range of countries across the breadth of our degrees, because this is the nature of what makes a great education. A great education is one where you are ready for the world as it will be, and where you are challenged in your preconceptions. That is what research does. That's what a good education should do. And I tell you, one of the best ways to challenge someone's preconceptions is to put them in a cultural environment where they have to understand that the world is not as they have always apprehended it.
Our next question comes from over here. We'll get a microphone to you. Sir, can you put your hand up in the air so we can see you, so we can get a microphone over there? Thanks, Christina. And then if I can try and shoehorn one or two more. I saw you over there, madam, and yes, I'll try and come to you.
We're starting to hear from career advisors, etc., that students should consider in their planning to go on to postgraduate study. So an undergraduate degree is less important from getting work in the future. I'd like your comments on the postgraduate model as you see it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and it's our impression too that, you know, if you sign up for one, you've got to sign up for two now.
So next year, frightening thought, there'll be the first students coming onto campus all across Australia who were born in 2000.
Oh my God.
And they will be in the workforce until 2065 at minimum, and possibly longer. And the notion that we know what to teach them successfully out to it is, patently nonsense. It is increasingly likely that they will pick up second degrees along their way. The proportion of Australians with second degrees is still amongst the lowest in the developed world, so I want to get carried away about it. But it's just the reality of the way the labour market is changing and expectations are changing, that a lot more people than is currently the case will go on through. And they'll typically do something that you see all the time, a lawyer who gets a general law degree and starts practising and builds expertise in, say, consumer and competition law, and at some point, often 10 years into their career, will go on to get a master's degree or something else that focuses on that level in detail. That is the pattern we're seeing. It's an organic pattern. It's not being forced by either universities or anybody else, but you can see it growing. To me, it makes perfect sense because that's the reality of the way knowledge is shifting. It doesn't have to be a degree. There might be a whole range of other ways we could deliver the same expertise. But in a sense, it may well be that the pattern becomes your first degree is the one where you live on campus and you have and you have the international experience and so on. And the second degree is the one where you're more likely to study part-time, you're more likely to pick it up, and that's how we'll go.
We're right up against it, and I'm glad that I've left the funding question right there because I did not want this entire conversation derailed by the issue of funding and fights with the federal government and the like. But on that, just some reflections from each of you, and John, we'll start with you. How do you intend to keep funding what it is that you want to do at La Trobe?
Well, government remains an important source of funding for universities, although they're now, I think, a minority source of revenue for us, about 40% or thereabouts.
But isn't that interesting, a minority source? I mean, who would have thought that, say, 20 years ago?
I mean, and it wasn't that long ago that it would have been 80%.
Yeah.
So that's another respect in which there's been a massive shift in the sector.
So the rest comes from?
So the rest comes from fee-paying students and various other forms of non-government revenue, such as research, consulting, but mostly students. I mean, 70 or 80% of revenue would come from students. And at the moment, that has to be our primary focus in terms of continuing to sustain ourselves financially. What's interesting, and I'm observing this around the sector at the moment, is that perhaps in response to Glyn's comment about lack of diversity in the system, I think a lot of universities now are playing at what you might call the edge of their organisation and experimenting with new business models. You don't have to look very far to see that happening here in Victoria. So Swinburne have recently established a joint venture with Seek.com to create online education services, which is known as Swinburne Online. It's been hugely successful. Deakin University is investing a lot of money in their what they call Deakin Digital, which, amongst other things, is looking at stackable micro-credentials. And yesterday, on Monday, what day is Monday? I was in Adelaide visiting Flinders University's new facility at Tonsley, where they've invested $120 million in a building that now contains 75 startup companies.
Right.
So what you're seeing is universities who in their core business are driven by very uniform incentives and therefore look and behave in many respects uniformly, but they're experimenting at the edges and looking for new ways of innovating in a way that they can bring back into the organisation. And I think that's possibly part of the future for the sector.
Margaret?
So Australia is in a very similar position to a number of Western economies, and that is where the government, one way or another, is attempting to constrain or actively reduce the amount of money it's spending on tertiary education, but universities in particular. I think the challenge in front of us is, yes, we are innovating and trying other things, and our universities, we're not dependent on government funding, though it's not unimportant. I think that the issue is that we have to get the balances right in this. So there are two things about disruption that I think people don't understand when they're talking about disruption. Universities are the authors of disruption. We are part of the big technological disruption. That's what we do. We are the authors of social disruption. Where do the things like computers and all those sorts of things come from in technological disruption?
Yep.
Where do the ideas on democracy and socialism and human rights come from? Universities. So we are authors of disruption, and we have to be able to have a mechanism to be safe and protected to question. And there is a role for government in making sure that you have a vital set of institutions that do that horrible thing, which is question that very thing. So government has to decide where it is supposed to be funding in order to protect what I'd call vital roles, and it also has a reason to invest in its population and its future. And I don't think we're having that fundamental discussion. We're just having, we spend this much and it should be less. And that's not where the discussion should start, nor where it should end.
Glyn?
I was enjoying that and listening and thinking about it. Both excellent points. Melbourne gets about 22% of its income from the federal government as direct subsidy, predictable subsidy, and the rest is student fees or money won through competitions or money won through research and so on. In that sense, we're more like an American system now than a British system. We have, as a nation, decided that students should bear the bulk of the cost of running universities, and we have transferred that cost consistently but incrementally, so there isn't a sharp single point. We've done it over a generation, where Australian students are now carrying the burden and carrying debt, therefore, of a level we haven't seen before.
International students.
And international students. So that's just, it's the families of Melbourne, and above all the families of China and Singapore and Malaysia who are funding universities in Australia. There will be a day when people start to say, is this reasonable? And if it turns on us, we will have a really significant problem.
We are right out of time, but I just very quickly want to finish, if I can. Maybe you can project yourself into the person who was born in 2000 and who's about to enrol next year. Panellists, what would you enrol in if you were that person? What would you study, Margaret? Right now, not the person you are now, but the young person now.
Oh, gee, would I be different now than I was when I was 18 and made the decision not to do what my mother said I should do?
What did she say you should do?
She said, teaching's a good job for a woman, she said. And I said, no, I am never going into the thing that she said was a good job for a woman. And guess what? I became an academic kid. So I did economics. Look, I would choose... Frankly, I would probably choose to be in two places. I understand the double degree impulse, and I'm not just saying that because I'm at Monash, because the ability to just range across a series of...
So give me what would the 2 degrees be, 2 areas?
Well, I still have the thing I didn't really get much of a chance to do. I would probably do an arts degree, which I didn't do. I did an economics degree. And, no, you know what? I'd do economics again.
John?
Well, I studied in England and I studied law, which wouldn't be common in Australia. Normally you'd study law with something else, or you'd study something else and then do law under the Melbourne model. I'd study something else. I'm not sure what it would be.
Can it reflect or pick one?
It would be, because I can't really, I'm not very good at maths, so it would have to be in the social sciences.
Okay.
Yeah.
Glyn?
My parents no one in my family had ever been to university, so I didn't have anyone to talk to. My parents were incredibly good about saying, we'll support you whatever you did. And they were very good when I had to come home and said, I said I was going to do medicine because that's what I was planning to do. I have decided to shift to arts. I came home on my first day.
I can imagine the crestfallen faces.
No, they were great, absolutely great. And I'm deeply appreciative of it. If I could have, I would have done PPE, politics, philosophy and economics. It wasn't available anywhere in Australia when I was a student. You would have had to go to Oxford to do it.
It's available at the Trobe.
It's available. Yeah.
And with that, we'll finish our conversation. Please thank our panellists.
And we introduced it, and you and I introduced it at Griffith. So.
Yeah.
A great discussion, a great deal to reflect on. Please thank our marvellous panellists this evening.
Thank you.
Margaret, Gardner, John Dewar and Glyn Davis. And thank you very much as well. Thank you.
We have some small. I have some small gifts to give to our, my fellow panellists and our wonderful host. Could you thank Virginia for navigating her way through this so beautifully?
We're going to take our headsets off because they really